Illinois faces some big challenges. Today, we're about to hear a truly honest analysis of the problems we face. Equally as important, you'll also hear an in-depth discussion of some practical solutions. This is your radio source for stories, the insight, and the answers you won't hear anywhere else. Not in the media and not coming from Springfield. You're listening to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Now, here's your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Good afternoon, Dan Proft, back on another edition of Illinois Rising. My co-host this week is Hilary Gowins. She's the managing editor of the Illinois Policy Institute. Hilary, welcome.
Thanks, Dan. I'm glad to be here.
Very good. And so a big week in state government. The fight this week over funding of higher education, not just the funding of universities themselves, but also MAP grants. And there was a rally at Chicago State University where cameras were there. So then Jesse Jackson Sr. was obviously there as well, following the cameras as he is wont to do. And he took the occasion of this rally at Chicago State for MAP grant funding to compare Governor Rauner to segregationist Governor George Wallace, and from the 60s, Jesse Jackson saying the following.
Apparently is indifferent to racism and poverty and the result thereof. He's willing to sacrifice this school on the altar of a budget.
Governor Rauner indifferent to racism and poverty. That's the charge Jesse Jackson lodged, in addition to the comparison to George Wallace, which of course is indicative of Jesse Jackson Sr. not being a serious person. But the underlying issue of MAP funding. Rauner wants to do one thing with a bipartisan bill sponsored by Ken Duncan, Chicago Democrat, that would fund MAP grants. And Madigan and Cullerton want to do another thing with a bill that wouldn't fund MAP grants, and somehow Rauner is the modern-day segregationist. It's quite a contention that Jesse Jackson and some of the university presidents and certainly the Democrat legislative leaders in Springfield are making, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an interesting point to bring up. Really, the MAP grant situation is a byproduct of a higher education system that has brought tuition costs for students that are totally unaffordable for low-income and even middle-class kids. And it's a system that has been brought about under the watch of Madigan and Cullerton much longer than, Rauner's tenure. So the problem goes back a lot farther than what they're pointing out right now.
Well, and let's bring our friend Ted Dabrowski. He's the Vice President of Policy at the Illinois Policy Institute into this conversation. Ted, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So earlier this week on my morning show, we talked to State Representative Mark Batnick, a Republican freshman from Plainfield, who kind of become an expert in this area of higher ed funding. And he makes the point that, we spend twice as much as the average state on higher ed per student, and yet tuition at Illinois colleges and universities is 30 to 60% higher than their conference peers. So it's not a spending problem, at least relative to other states, and yet we have high tuition, and yet the people that are in charge are not to blame. The guy who's been there for 12 months and is actually trying to fund MAP grants is. Can you kind of unpack all of this for us?
Yeah, I think what's happened is this whole budget crisis is being used to blame Rauner and his attempts to reform higher education finance. But when you strip out the problems, this budget crisis is just really exposing the massive cracks that exist in higher education. And what's happened is that these university leaders don't want you to know it, but they've created these massive jobs programs at higher ed, and they've just blown up the number of administrators they have. They have way too many administrators. The pay is so high that the only way to pay all those people, the executive pay that they're getting, is to really raise tuition rates to rates that are no longer affordable for that that person trying to make ends meet. And so you've got too many administrators, way too high executive pay, massive pensions, and the way they're doing that is just taking it out of the height of kids in high tuitions.
Yeah, Ted, so I was looking at the numbers. I saw a report that you wrote, was released last week, and I saw that, for example, the highest paid admin at the University of Illinois Chicago in 2014, she made $887,000 in salary and bonuses, which would have funded approximately 329 MAP grants. So that sort of brings to light the disparity and the problem here. So we've got
one administrator made 900
one
grand?
administrator. So Ted, can you unpack that too?
Wow.
I mean, let's talk about tuition, because tuition in the last 10 years at state schools in Illinois has doubled.
Yeah, they've doubled, and I think you're hitting why. It's not just the high-end guys who get that, but Paula Allen Mears got nearly $900,000 in 2014 from the University of Illinois. To pay for that, think about what tuitions have to be to pay for that. But it's not just her at the top spot. There are so many administrators now. The growth in administration has far outpaced the student growth, which has really been pretty small.
She should have to. She should have to coach. She should have to coach the men's basketball team at U of I, in addition to whatever else she's supposedly doing for 900 grand.
Well, I don't know, Dan. I think they should be getting about $2 million or $3 million.
Yeah,
so.
well, I know, but I mean, good 900 grand for an administrator at U of I. What does she do?
Yeah, it's amazing, but it's more the number of administrators in addition to that. So let's talk about Chicago State, which has been the one that's gotten a lot of the attention. It's gotten to the point now. This is amazing that there's almost one administrator for every professor. So it's almost like if you were standing in your class and you were there, there'd be a professor talking and an administrator right there standing right next to him or her, overseeing what's going on. And that's what's driven up the cost so much.
It's like the Department of Ag joke, the old Department of Ag joke. A guy walks into the Department of Agriculture and he sees a guy in his head. He sees a guy at his desk with his head down and he's crying, and he walks up and says, "What are you crying about?" And the guy picks up his head and he says, "My farmer died." No. No, I thought that's a good one. I like that.
Good.
That's pretty good big government humor.
That is.
Thank you,
Ted. I think the bottom line, what is making me so angry about this, is that at the end of the day, the problem for families is that college, even at a state school, is unaffordable. It's out of reach. It's not something that you can get if you're a kid by working your way through school. Tuition is growing at a rate that we just can't keep up with.
Well, yeah, I was talking to a buddy of mine, and we both worked our way through. I went to Georgia Tech, and we worked our way through all the time. And you could do that back then. You could have a job, earn a decent amount of pay, and tuition was affordable enough that you could do both. Today, it's really hard to do that. Tuitions have doubled in the last decade, and jobs are harder to come by, especially in Illinois. So to do that is phenomenal.
And so these MAP grants, let's go back to this because this was the topic du jour on Higher Ed this week. MAP grants that are provided to a wide range of Illinois colleges and universities for students. Go back to the political fight in Springfield. Governor Rauner vetoes the legislative leader's proposal in this area. They fail to override his veto, and he's got a bipartisan piece of legislation that would fund the MAP grants for these students that is awaiting action. Explain the difference between the two and what happened this past week.
Well, the thing is that the Democrats want to pass a bill that effectively just spends money that we don't have. And Rauner, of course, is trying to get the reforms. There's two things going on. One is he wants the budgetary reforms so that we don't keep doing deficit spending, borrowing, and having an unbalanced budget that we've had for now nearly 2 decades. So that's number one. Number two, though, is before he hands more money to the colleges and universities, he wants to see them reform. Because if not, all they do is they take the state money and they hire more people and they raise tuition. And so it defeats the purpose of trying to fund higher ed. So he's trying to come up with a bill that is funded, that there is money there to give to the MAP grants, and to ensure that when we pay MAP grants, then suddenly we're not then we have a problem if we don't have revenues for that. We're just going to create more problems with the social service agencies that are waiting for money. So he's trying to avoid multiple problems at the same time. And
so one of the other things was some of these university presidents saying, we don't want to get involved in politics. We're not playing politics. We haven't been told by legislative leaders to appear or not appear with the governor or any other politician, because this was an allegation the governor had made that Madigan told him don't appear with the governor until after the primary. Yet Chicago State president there is rallying with Jesse Sr. while he's calling the governor George Wallace.
Well, I think what's amazing is that university president may want to look at his administrative staff. We just calculated the numbers, and if Chicago State reduced its bloated administration, and I mentioned they have one administrator for every faculty member, if they reduce their administration by a third, they could fund every one of those MAP grants that is not funded today.
Right, and so, it's worth pointing, I don't think I've said this explicitly, the MAP grants are for low-income students. So, they're the champions of low-income students, but they won't reorganize their own house to to free up money to provide access to their colleges or universities for said low-income students.
Yeah, and then that's why I think in the end these have become job programs for adults, and they're forgetting the kids who now can't afford to go there. I think we got to flip this thing on its head and change the narrative. Has nothing to do with the budget crisis. It has all to do with a decades-long bloat and growth in salaries and pensions. We didn't even talk about pensions. That's eating up most of the state aid that's going from the state to universities.
And so that's the point, going back to this twice as much as the average state on higher ed, what Illinois spends per student. It's not like that money is going to the classroom, very much like at the K through 12 level. It's going to the administrative overhead, the pensions, the benefits, and the like.
That's right. And if you look at the pensions that all these administrators will get, most of them will retire in their 50s because they're allowed to retire in their 50s. And they'll bring in their retirement life, they'll bring in $3 to $5 to $6 million in pension income, and that's what the kids' tuitions are trying to pay for, and it just doesn't work that way. It shouldn't work that way. He
is Ted Dabrowski, Vice President of Policy at the Illinois Policy Institute. Ted, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.